My name is Ruth Calloway, and I am 60 years old. For 38 years, I lived in the same house my late husband and I built together on a quiet street outside Portland. Every wall, every floorboard, every rose bush in the front yard held a memory I could touch. We paid that mortgage together, side by side, month after month. We raised our son Nathan in those rooms. After my husband Gerald passed 7 years ago, I kept everything running on my own. The taxes, the repairs, the leaking roof in the winter of 2019 that cost me $4,000 I didn't have. I handled all of it alone. I worked 30 years as a public school librarian. That job teaches you things no university ever could. Patience, fairness, how to stay calm when the world around you is being completely unreasonable. So when Nathan and his wife needed a place to stay, I opened my door without a second thought. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. Nathan called me on a Tuesday evening in March. His voice had that careful tone he used when he needed something but didn't want to ask directly. He said he and his wife Brianna had hit a rough patch financially. Their apartment lease was ending. They just needed somewhere to land for a few months while they sorted things out. I didn't hesitate. Not even for a moment. I told him to come home. Nathan was my only child. Gerald and I had wanted more children, but it never happened. So everything I had, every sacrifice I ever made, was poured into that boy. He wasn't a bad person. He was just weak in the way that some men become weak when the wrong woman gets her hands on them early enough. I didn't know that yet. Not fully. I just knew my son needed help, and I was his mother. Brianna arrived with 12 boxes for suitcases and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was 32 years old, tall, with sharp features and the kind of confidence that fills a room before a person even speaks. She hugged me at the door and called me Mom immediately, which should have felt warm but somehow felt like she was staking a claim. Nathan carried the heavy boxes. Brianna directed him like she was supervising a move into her own property. I showed them the guest room. It was a good size, with a window that faced the backyard garden I had tended for 20 years. I had freshened it up with clean linens and new curtains. I had even cleared out the closet completely. Brianna looked around it slowly. Then she looked down the hallway toward my bedroom door. She didn't say anything that first day, but I noticed where her eyes went. The first 2 weeks were pleasant enough. Brianna cooked dinner twice and complimented the kitchen. Nathan helped me fix the back fence that had been leaning since November. We ate together most evenings and it almost felt like family again. But small things bothered me quietly. Brianna rearranged the kitchen cabinets without asking. She moved Gerald's old reading chair from the living room corner to make space for a new lamp she ordered online. When I mentioned that the chair had always lived in that corner, she smiled and said, "I just thought it would flow better this way." I moved the chair back the next morning. She moved it again that afternoon. I noticed how she walked through the house. Not like a guest. Not like someone grateful for shelter. She walked slowly, touching surfaces, looking at walls, measuring things with her eyes in a way I couldn't quite explain but couldn't quite ignore either. It was a Saturday in late April when everything changed. I had spent the day at my sister Norma's house across town. We had lunch, walked around her neighborhood, and I stayed longer than I planned because it felt good to laugh freely. I drove home in the early evening feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I walked through the front door and immediately noticed something wrong. The hallway was cluttered with boxes. My boxes. I recognized my own things. The framed photos from my nightstand. The extra blankets from my closet shelf. My late husband's Bible that I kept beside my bed every single night since the day he died. All of it stacked in the hallway like it was waiting for a rubbish truck. My bedroom door was open. The light was on. Brianna was sitting on my bed. She looked up at me without flinching. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't apologetic. She was completely, almost aggressively calm. "Margaret," she said, then corrected herself smoothly. "Ruth, we decided this room makes more sense for us. You'll be much more comfortable in the guest room. It's cozy. I stood in the doorway and looked at her sitting on the bed Gerald and I had shared for over 2 decades. The bed where I had cried the night he was diagnosed. The bed where I had held his hand the last morning he was strong enough to hold mine back. She was sitting on that bed with her legs crossed, scrolling through curtain options on her phone. Nathan appeared behind me in the hallway. He didn't meet my eyes. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked back at Brianna. "What gave you the right?" I asked quietly. She shrugged one shoulder. "This house will be ours eventually anyway." I nodded slowly. "We'll see about that." They had moved all my furniture into the guest room while I was gone. My dresser. My nightstand. Even the small rug Gerald and I had bought together on our 20th anniversary trip to Savannah. Everything was crammed into the smaller room without any care for arrangement or meaning. That night I lay in the narrow guest bed and stared at the ceiling. I didn't cry. I was past the age where injustice made me cry. Instead, my mind became very clear and very still, the way it always did when something important needed to be figured out. I had been patient my whole life. Patient with difficult library patrons. Patient through Gerald's illness. Patient through years of fixing this house alone without anyone to help me carry it. But patience is not the same as weakness. I reached into the nightstand drawer, the one I had transferred from my old room, and took out an envelope I had kept there for years. The next morning I watched Brianna through the hallway. She had already ordered new curtains for my bedroom. A paint color chart was spread across the kitchen table, and she was circling shades with a red pen. She talked about tearing out the built-in shelving Gerald had made by hand along the bedroom wall. Nathan sat quietly eating his toast. I made my coffee and said nothing, but I listened to everything. That afternoon, while Brianna was out, Nathan sat across from me at the kitchen table and started to speak. He said something about how Brianna just thought it made practical sense. He said the master bedroom was bigger. He said she didn't mean anything by it. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question. "Nathan, whose name is on the deed to this house?" He looked down at his coffee. He didn't answer. Because he already knew. That week I called my attorney, a calm, steady man named Frank Oakes who had handled Gerald's estate and helped me with every legal matter since. I sat in his office on a Thursday afternoon and explained everything carefully. The move. The bedroom. What Brianna had said about the house becoming theirs eventually. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set down his pen and said, "Ruth, you've been more than generous letting them stay rent-free. Legally, they have no claim whatsoever. You can remove them whenever you choose." I told him I didn't want to act yet. Frank raised an eyebrow. I said, "Something tells me she isn't finished. And I want to see exactly how far this goes before I respond." Frank nodded slowly. He had known me long enough to trust my instincts. We made a plan together. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't announce itself until the right moment. Brianna got comfortable very quickly. By the second week of May, she had repainted my bedroom walls a shade of gray I found cold and unwelcoming. She replaced my curtains with heavy linen panels that blocked the morning light Gerald had always loved. She put a small locked box on what had been his side of the dresser. She began speaking about the house in a new way. Not as a place she was staying in. As a place she was managing. She told me one evening over dinner, almost gently, that I shouldn't stress myself over household decisions anymore. That she and Nathan could handle things. Then she said something that chilled me to my core. She looked up from her plate and said casually, "Retirement homes are actually really lovely these days. Some of them have gardens and everything." Nathan laughed. It was an awkward laugh, the kind that meant he didn't know what else to do. I smiled politely and said absolutely nothing. The financial plans started surfacing in early June. Brianna began talking openly about remodeling the kitchen. Expanding the back patio. She showed Nathan photos of open-plan layouts on her tablet at the breakfast table, like they were planning their own home renovation show. One morning I asked her directly how they planned to pay for any of it. She answered without hesitation. "Once the house is in our name, we'll refinance against the equity. The place is worth a lot more than people think." She said it the way someone says something obvious. Like the outcome was already settled and we were just waiting for paperwork to catch up with reality. I almost laughed right there at the kitchen table. Because I knew something she didn't know. Something that would make every single one of those plans dissolve the moment she truly understood it. I overheard them arguing on a Wednesday night. I was passing the kitchen doorway, and their voices carried clearly through the gap. Brianna's voice was sharp and frustrated. She said, "Your mother is sitting on nearly $500,000 in property and acting like she's doing us a favor by letting us sleep here." Nathan said something too quiet for me to catch. Brianna said, "We need to move faster. Stop being soft about it." I stood in the hallway for a moment longer than I should have. Then I walked quietly back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. The situation had just become something entirely different. This wasn't a daughter-in-law who was rude and ungrateful. This was a woman with a specific plan, a financial plan. And my son was either part of it willingly or too frightened of her to stop it. Either way, my response needed to match the seriousness of what I was dealing with. Brianna began introducing me differently when guests visited. Her friend Paulette came over one Saturday afternoon. Brianna gave her a tour of the house as if she owned every room of it. When they passed me in the hallway, Brianna gestured and said cheerfully, "This is Nathan's mom. She stays with us." Paulette smiled politely. I smiled back. But those 4 words settled into me like stones dropping into still water. She stays with us. In my own home. The home I built. The home I paid for. The home where I buried my husband's memory in every corner, every drawer, every rose in the front garden that he planted with his own 2 hands the spring before he got sick. I stayed calm on the outside. But on the inside I was absolutely certain of one thing. This had stopped being about a bedroom a long time ago. This was a takeover. I spent the following 2 weeks in quiet preparation. I gathered every document related to the house, the original title, the insurance policy, 7 years of tax records, the deed, which carried only one name, mine. I also retrieved something else. A document Frank Oakes had helped me prepare 18 months earlier when I had first started thinking clearly about my future and what I wanted to happen to this house when I was gone. I had drafted it after a long conversation with Frank about legacy and intention and what Gerald would have wanted. I had never signed it. I had kept it in the envelope in my drawer, waiting until I was completely sure. Now I was completely sure. I called Frank on a Friday morning. I told him I was ready to move forward. He told me to come in Monday. That weekend I was the most peaceful I had been in months. The Sunday before my Monday appointment, Brianna knocked on my guest room door. She stood in the doorway with a pleasant expression that didn't match her words. She told me, quite calmly, that she and Nathan had decided the master bathroom was now their private space. She said I should use the smaller bathroom down the hall going forward. The master bathroom had been mine for 38 years. I had chosen the tiles myself. I had picked out the fixtures with Gerald on a rainy Saturday afternoon at a hardware store that didn't even exist anymore. I looked at Brianna for a long moment. Then I nodded quietly and said, "All right." She looked slightly surprised that I didn't argue. She shouldn't have been. I wasn't arguing because I didn't need to. I had an appointment in less than 24 hours that would make every bathroom in the house irrelevant to her future plans. The following Saturday, Brianna announced a family dinner. She invited Nathan's Aunt Carol, 2 cousins, and a couple she and Nathan were friendly with from their old neighborhood. She cooked for most of the afternoon and set the table with my good dishes, the ones I only used for Thanksgiving and Christmas. She was glowing, hosting, performing. Halfway through the meal, she raised her glass and said proudly, "I just want to say that we are so excited about the future. This house is going to be something really special for the next generation." Everyone smiled and raised their glasses. I raised mine too. I let the moment breathe. Then I set my glass down gently, folded my hands on the table, and stood up. The table went quiet. "I'd like to share something too," I said. I told everyone at that table something simple. I said, "This house already belongs to someone." Brianna smiled. She thought I was about to confirm what she had been building toward all evening. I could see it in her face. The satisfaction of someone who believes they have already won. She even nodded slightly and said, "Yes, exactly." I let her finish nodding. Then I said, "It belongs to me. Completely. My name alone is on the deed. It has never belonged to anyone else, and no verbal assumption changes that legal fact." The table went absolutely silent. Aunt Carol looked at her plate. The cousins exchanged a glance. Brianna's smile stayed on her face for 3 full seconds before her expression understood what her ears had just heard. But that moment at the dinner table was only the first layer. The real answer was still coming. After the dinner, Brianna changed strategies. The open hostility softened into something more calculated. She started being warm toward me again. She made breakfast and left a plate outside my door. She asked about my sister Norma. She complimented my garden. But Frank Oakes called me on a Tuesday morning with something that explained exactly why. He told me that Brianna had contacted a local bank 2 weeks earlier. She had inquired about refinancing possibilities on a property on our street. She had described herself as a future owner. She had done this before the dinner. Before any conversation. Before any legal transfer of any kind. She had walked into a bank and spoken about my home as if it were already hers. That phone call from Frank confirmed what I had suspected since the night I came home to find my belongings in the hallway. This was never about needing a place to stay. On a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the dinner, I came home from my morning walk and found strangers in my living room. 2 men with measuring tape and a clipboard. Brianna stood beside them looking completely at ease. She introduced them as contractors she had hired to look at opening up the living room wall to extend into the dining space. She said it breezily, like she was telling me about a grocery trip. I stood in my own doorway and asked her to please have them leave. She looked at me with that patient smile she had been using lately and said, "Relax, Ruth. It's our house soon anyway. We're just getting ahead of things." I asked the contractors politely to reschedule, and they left, sensing the tension immediately. I turned to Brianna. I said, "I'd like you both in the living room this evening. There's something I need to tell you." That afternoon, a certified letter arrived. I had asked Frank to send it formally, addressed to both Nathan and Brianna. It stated clearly and in plain language that they were residing in the property as informal tenants at the sole discretion of the legal owner. It noted there was no lease agreement in place. It outlined that any modifications to the property without written owner consent were prohibited and potentially actionable. It also formally requested that the contractors not return to the property. I heard Brianna open it in the kitchen. The silence that followed was very long. Then her voice came through the wall, low and tight and furious, asking Nathan what this was. Nathan said something I couldn't hear. Brianna said, quite clearly, she cannot do this. But that letter wasn't the main event. It was just the door swinging open. The real announcement was still waiting for that evening. I sat them both down in the living room at 7 o'clock. Nathan looked pale. Brianna sat stiffly with her arms crossed, the certified letter folded on the cushion beside her. I spoke calmly. I told them I had made a major decision about the house. A legal one. A permanent one. I told them I had spent several weeks working with my attorney to finalize something I had been considering for a long time. Brianna uncrossed her arms. I could see her recalculating, rearranging her expectations. She had spent months moving toward what she believed was an inevitable outcome, and now she was trying to figure out if this announcement was the moment she had been waiting for. Her expression shifted toward something that almost looked like anticipation. She thought she had worn me down. She thought patience had finally run out and I was about to give her what she wanted. She was right that patience had run out. She was completely wrong about everything else. I told them I had transferred the house. Brianna sat forward. Nathan looked up. I watched her face move from tension into something close to relief. Then I finished my sentence. I have placed this property into a charitable housing trust. The relief evaporated instantly. Brianna said, "What does that mean?" I explained it clearly. The house was now legally held in a trust one had established with Frank's help. I retained full rights to live in it for the remainder of my life. Nothing about my daily situation changed at all. But after my passing, the house would not go to family. It would be converted into affordable housing for local public school teachers, people who served their community the way I had served mine for 30 years. The silence in that living room was the deepest silence I had ever heard inside those walls. Brianna stood up. She said the trust had to be undone, that I hadn't thought it through, that I was making an emotional decision, that Gerald would have wanted Nathan to have the house. I told her Gerald had left the house entirely to me, that I knew his wishes better than she ever could, and that this decision honored both of us. She turned to Nathan and said he needed to talk to me. That I was throwing away their future. That I was being cruel. Nathan sat very still. Brianna demanded to know the name of my attorney so she could call him herself. I told her she was welcome to contact Frank Oakes. That he would confirm everything she was hearing was legal, final, and entirely within my rights as the sole owner of the property. She picked up her phone and walked out of the room. The trust document had been signed and filed 2 weeks earlier. There was nothing left to undo. They moved out on a Sunday morning in August. Brianna packed with the focused silence of someone who had decided that dignity meant not acknowledging defeat out loud. She didn't look at me. She carried boxes past me in the hallway without making eye contact once. Nathan stopped before he reached the front door. He turned around and looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was a small boy who had done something wrong and knew it. He said he was sorry. Not for Brianna. For himself. For going along with things he should have stopped. I told him I loved him. That my door was open to him whenever he wanted to walk through it honestly. He nodded and left. I stood in my own hallway and listened to their car pull out of the driveway. Then I walked slowly to the end of the hall, opened the master bedroom door, and stepped inside. It took me 3 weeks to restore the bedroom exactly as it had been. I repainted the walls the warm cream color Gerald and I had chosen together the summer we retired. I put his Bible back on the nightstand on his side of the dresser. I rehung the photographs that had lived on those walls for decades. I found the small rug from Savannah folded in the back of the hall closet where I had quietly moved it for safekeeping months before. I put it back where it belonged. The morning I finished, I stood in the doorway and looked at the room in the early light. I thought about the evening Brianna had sat on my bed, phone in hand, circling curtain colors, telling me the room was hers now. I thought about how certain she had been. I smiled softly to myself. Because in the end, she had come into my home planning to take everything. She left with nothing. And the house that she had spent nearly 6 months trying to claim, it would one day shelter teachers who gave their lives to children the way I once had. Not a single square foot of it would ever carry her name.